which kicks off this Friday, I thought who better than to get my good friend Matt, who can come in and talk to us about what to expect. So hello, Matt.
Hello.
How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Glad to be on.
You're the first guest on the last Palabra podcast.
Oh, what a thrill.
Thanks for coming on and talking rugby.
No, it's always a pleasure to discuss certain things, especially rugby.
So, what's kind of your connection to rugby? Should we go through that first?
Oh, yeah. Started playing at 5. Stopped playing sporadically in my later years, so I'm now 30-ish. Currently coaching.
30-ish.
Well, you get close enough, don't you? Then you might as well say it.
You might as well say it.
So,
I'm closer than you are, but hey.
yeah. Started coaching at a regional level now, which is fun. And then still involved with grassroots through university section, so that's also enjoyable.
So it's fair to say that you're like a lifelong fan of rugby.
Very fair, yeah.
So you're fairly well qualified, at least from the point of view of the fan, if not from having played it and coached it, to talk about the Japanese Rugby World Cup coming up.
Absolutely, fairly. You're using these terms very loosely.
Fairly. So it kicks off on Friday, right?
It does indeed, yeah. Somewhat anticlimactically, I know you've pointed out before.
Well, I was tipped off by you, and so that was why I was like, rather than me talking about it, I may as well bring you on and get it from the horse's mouth, as it were.
Yeah, so, I mean, with the Olympics a few years back, we know that the opening ceremony is going to be a massive spectacle. And then to have that followed up by Japan versus Russia, which, it's not a dream fixture, let's put it that way. I mean, previous years, it's just been absolute world beaters playing absolute world beaters, and it's sort of almost lived up to the hype, but I feel this year it's gonna struggle.
So I want to just back up a second to the opening ceremony. Do you think this is going to be like a warm up for Tokyo 2020, the Summer Olympics?
I believe so. I mean, you think about all these big events, it's just basically one country just showing what they can achieve and what they can show the rest of the world, and I don't think Japan's going to be any different.
So after the opening ceremony, Russia had a mare in recent matches.
Yeah, their run-up hasn't been the most successful, let's put it that way.
They've lost to local clubs, right? Isn't that the...
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty is when looking to push for a World Cup bid, it's difficult to strike the balance between a successful run and then also basically making sure that you're putting the best team out at the right times. So they will be looking for various players that may not make their starting 15 during the World Cup, but at the same time, if you're going to be on the world stage, you need to be able to beat a reasonably good second-tier English team in say Jersey Reds that they lost to a matter of days ago.
So, who else is in the Japan-Russia group? Do you know? Do we know that?
Yeah, we do. So
let me pull that up. Go on.
So Japan, Russia, both in Pool A. So alongside Ireland and Scotland, with Samoa as well. So not necessarily the most competitive pool, it has to be said, in this World Cup, with Ireland and Scotland both not really competing too well.
But Ireland are going into this ranked number 1 in the world, right?
They are. But if you look back across the media over the last few weeks, you'll see that there's loads of people giving their opinion on the world ranking system. And although more often than not it's fairly respective of where international rugby is, in the lead up to a World Cup, you've got so many teams putting out so many different sides that the results don't really they aren't really representative of what that team is capable of. So I think it's fair to say.
So the current.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like the current rankings don't reflect the reality.
Well, the way you've got to think about it, if Ireland played New Zealand tomorrow, who would win? With the way Ireland played in their last few games, it's not been the most inspiring rugby. And because various other things have happened in the lead up, it means that various different teams are in different ranking positions. So they get different points for the wins that they've had. So they're beating Wales, although it was a dire game, not really much to take away from it. Winning that game put them top.
So, but they've not faced New Zealand in the run up to this to earn that top spot, as it were?
Thinking back to the last time they played New Zealand, I think they beat them in America in their one-off game. That was quite a triumph. But again, it will always be described, I think, as a one-off. I think it's very rare that Ireland would be in a position to go into a game against New Zealand and be favourites.
Makes sense. That's understandable. So Pool A then: Ireland, Scotland, Japan, Russia, and Samoa. Anything we can expect of the home side?
Given last World Cup with their victory over South Africa, I think there's always chance of an upset. I think they'll probably top Russia, and the Samoa game I think will be very close. But the Pacific nations are always keen for an upset in World Cup situations, being the underdog quite often and sort of the forgotten nation of the World Cup. But I feel Ireland should top that group. And you never know with Scotland. Scotland could come second, could come fifth in that group. So it's one of those that's very open.
So looking at the other pools, Pool B, obviously is New Zealand with South Africa in that one. That's a pretty challenging pool, especially for the other teams there, Italy, Namibia and Canada.
Exactly, yeah. You wouldn't want to be one of those three.
No, that story's pretty much already written, I'd imagine. The headlines are already done.
Yeah, it's either New Zealand at the top of that and the other one's going through on the best runner-up stage. I feel the games between the other three nations, I think, are fairly uneventful, I'd have to say.
Okay, so little action in Pool B.
Yeah, I see whitewashes across the board and then a very competitive game.
So it's been largely said that maybe Pool C, like England's pool, is the more competitive one. Am I right in thinking that?
I'd say Pool C, Pool D. With Pool C, obviously, you've got France and Argentina. Argentina not been on the best run of form, arguably since the last World Cup. I mean, they broke onto the Rugby Championship, and they've just not been able to hit the heights that they were expected to, which is surprising given the fact that a large group of those players played together at Jaguares in the top flight of Super Rugby.
And so, what do you think England's kind of outlook is for this pool, or at least getting past the pool stages, as it were?
My personal opinion, they'll ease their way through the group. Their only stumbling block, I believe, could be France, because obviously no one really knows how the French are going to travel. They had a decent run up to this World Cup with a very, very dominant performance over Scotland, albeit Scotland were fairly poor in that game. But they're sort of getting back to their flamboyant best, the kind of players that you'd have seen in the 90s and early 2000s, where they were just running teams ragged with this style that's sort of, it's undefendable, and it's similar to the kinds that you'd expect from the Samoans, the Fijians, the Tongans, in that they're just so open and willing to play. It's something really great to watch, but not often too successful on the international stage, where rugby is very much based around structure.
What do you mean based around structure? What's the set plays?
So yeah, structure doesn't generally relate specifically to set piece. A team can be far more structured throughout a game, even in open play. So the manner in which they'll play from specific positions on the pitch is dictated before the game's actually started. Whereas these more flamboyant teams like the French and the Pacific nations, they'll quite often be very willing to just play a very open, less structured game. Often coming from their roots in sevens. I mean, maybe not for the French, but with the way the game develops in those Pacific nations, and a massive emphasis put on their sevens development through specific skill development, they're more likely to play that open game because it's what they're used to.
And so is that kind of a common thing to have really different styles from country to country? Or from sort of more, not maybe country, but like area to area?
Absolutely. Obviously we've said with the Pacific nations, they're very open to play, but they're also very physical. The same can be said for a lot of African nations. And I think we'll expect that from both Namibia and South Africa this year, with both massive teams, and they're both very dominant, or both perceived very dominant packs. So they'll base a lot of what they do around a big set piece and massive defensive effort.
Okay. And so then looking at Pool D, Australia are probably the standout in there, maybe?
Yeah, I would say so.
Wales, Georgia, Fiji, and Uruguay.
Yes. Similar to Pool B, I reckon there's a competitive game in there, and then three teams that sort of trying to keep up. I think Fiji will probably come out on third position with Georgia and Uruguay bringing up the rear. Again, Georgia they had this surge into the international stage where their attempts to get into the Six Nations and obviously the things that have happened around the global game in terms of their World Rugby's attempts to get this international competition going year round. So basically trying to marry up the leagues of rugby, which unfortunately failed, but we'll see where that goes in the future.
Okay, so it looks to me like, I mean, I'm just a casual fan, which is why I thought I'd refer to you in this. It seems to me there's kind of like two major players in each pool, then backed up by kind of maybe one or two that could cause an upset, and then kind of one that seems like an easy win for the major players. Does this mean we could see some of the kind of the bigger teams not progressing from the pool stages?
I don't think so. I don't. People are saying that this is going to be a very open World Cup, but what I think that means is there's still going to be a disparity between Tier 1 and Tier 2 nations. It just means that there are more teams in that Tier 1 bracket that are likely to have a chance of winning. So Ireland, New Zealand, South Africa, England, Australia, Wales, France, you could see them having a decent run of games and getting to that final. Whereas in the past, it's been very limited. There have been very specified favourites for each World Cup, often New Zealand, and I mean that's pretty evidential in the fact they've won 3 already. So yeah, it's definitely an open World Cup, but I think people need to specify the difference between an open World Cup between the two tiers. In that the Tier 2 nations, I still don't think have a chance.
We have to remember 4 years ago, though, of course, we got knocked out at our home World Cup.
We don't have to.
So there's always that chance for upset. We don't have to remember. We can look past that.
Yeah, I think that was a particularly dark time in English rugby. With obviously there was the contention between the selection, with certain rugby league players being taken to that World Cup, but it was a perfect storm of terrible displays of rugby and some off-field issues with the press and media putting a lot of pressure on a select few players.
Could it be fair to say that then maybe England, like our team, is going back there now, wanting to prove a point, to kind of avenge this massive loss last time out? Especially after, we had a fairly strong Six Nations performance. And, is that something we can base our expectations on?
I think so, yeah. We must also think back to what Eddie Jones has said over the last however many years he's been involved since the last World Cup, basically. He's always said that everyone must judge him on his World Cup. So the fact that he won the Six Nations, the fact that he's had various successes, maybe not necessarily in the last year or so, but everything he's done has been geared towards the World Cup. I know that everything in his training ground is geared towards the World Cup. Not that he's been looking past games, but the idea that everything has happened in the last 4 years has pushed them to be in a better position to win this year. So the team itself, it's very, very different in their makeup. I think England itself has a much better balance this year.
What do you make of the England squad then? I'm looking at it now. I've got it in front of me, and aside from a couple of players, well, maybe a handful of players that have got like 1, 2. I think there's maybe two uncapped players in there, one uncapped player in there. We're looking at a fairly seasoned squad with maybe a few players thrown in that have got maybe like a dozen international outings or so.
Yeah. So I think looking at that squad, I think it's fairly easy not fairly easy. I mean, with Eddie Jones, he'll probably pick something incredibly maverick for that first game. Obviously, the first 2 games, expecting to win. It's difficult to really say what he's going to select, but moving into what should be the latter stages, you can mould generally what that team is going to look like, and I can't imagine there'll be too many lesser capped players playing in the latter stages, except for injury. I think we'll see various players with 50, 60 caps. So the team itself is not lacking in experience. But on the opposite side, they've got some very young players that are going to be very hungry to perform. Obviously, we saw in the warm-ups with Lewis Ludlam, who's at Northampton Saints, won 1 cap and outstanding in that game. Physically dominant and really wanted to stamp his mark on the game. So I think we've got incredibly good experience, and then also some depth with some really young, really talented, and hungry players.
So you've pointed out Lewis Ludlam, and this is something that I mean, I think this happens in a lot of sports actually. When it comes to like a world stage, that there's a
Mm.
standout player that kind of becomes the hero, you know, and bringing it home, if it, as it were. And often, you know, kind of a new player to the squad rather than a seasoned veteran, as it were. What I mean, do you think there's a reason for that? Firstly, and then, you know, is that something we could expect this
I think
this World Cup?
with newer players to a squad, your expectations are slightly lower to, say, a seasoned, highly capped player. Um, I don't think there's going to be much expectation on them. I think the expectation is going to be around these players such as uh, your Joe Marlers, who's come back into the squad, 58 caps. You've got players like Dan Colin around that squad, 86 caps. You've got obviously the Vunipola brothers who are up around 50 caps. Obviously led by Owen Farrell, who's still fairly young, has got 70 caps himself. I think that those are the players that they're going to base these teams around. And then the other players will sort of complement them quite well. I would say there's a significantly less pressure on those players, which allows them the freedom to play as you wouldn't expect them to on a high stage.
Yeah, I guess they just have to go out and impress. You know, there's nothing to lose for them at this
Absolutely.
point. They're there. They're on the world stage. They're playing at the
Yeah,
peak of the
and
sport, almost. You know.
they're young sportsmen. Now, young sportsmen, generally speaking, have got no issue with confidence, and obviously slightly expanded ego almost. But I wouldn't expect any of them to be lacking in that department.
I guess that makes sense. So you've kind of given us a breakdown of the Japan Russia the first game on Friday. I'm looking at the fixtures. The kind of big standout match over the weekend seems to be
That'll
New
be
Zealand South
huge.
Africa.
I think with that game, whoever comes out on top there, I would put down as favourites. Obviously, South Africa have had a pretty impressive lead up, and they're sort of peaking at the right times with a certain amount of controversy over recent weeks with the steroid scandal. Um, but as a squad, they're moving in the right direction, and a strong performance against New Zealand will really put them in a very good position to progress fast. And it's for the winner anyway. It's going to be a very good place to have that game at the start of a group where you're expected to win, and if you do win, you're then having that followed up by certain games where you can maybe rest some players, get some good rotation going. Exactly,
Kick
and
off
then
the whole
ride that
campaign
high
with a
through
bang, I guess.
to the knockout stages.
So what's the biggest pressure on these players as they go literally to the other side of the world and are competing on this world stage? What, you know, from an individual point, what are they up
A
against?
massive part of it is the media and the media spotlight. If they're managed well, and for England, obviously Eddie Jones takes a lot of that slack by he says some controversial things, and his justification that in the past has been to take the limelight off his players so they can focus on their rugby. So if that's done successfully, I think there's the pressure itself reduces significantly. I know previous years, obviously, there have been certain scandals that have followed people around with Anu Tuolangi taking on Freddie Flintstone with his Freddie Flintstone. Obviously, with in recent years with Manu Tuolangi donning the pedalo like a certain Freddie Flintoff, and you've got Mike Tindall in the past has been hounded by the media on occasions with you know yeah
For all kinds of
throwing
things.
midgets, that kind of thing. But as long as players can be kept out of that limelight, I think they're in a good stead to really perform well on the pitch.
But from the point of view of the fans, like the sport is one thing, but kind of seeing these personalities is a whole other thing. And I don't know. I guess maybe I don't know. A lot of fans, I think, live for that as well. You know, it doesn't help. It fuels
Well, yeah.
the
I
media
mean,
machine, as it were.
you've got millions of people living vicariously through these people. They want to know everything that's going on and everything they're doing in preparation. They want to obviously have their idea of what they should be doing. and in order to have that opinion, you need all the information. So you can understand why the media gets so invested in such a massive competition. But I do think that's at the detriment to the team performing. So it's a difficult position to be in, because obviously the media outlets want to obviously they want them more clicks, they want much more attention, which brings them more money. Some of them, you might argue, would want England to fail, because then they can write more explosive pieces about how certain things contributed to the downfall. And you saw that with the unfortunate last World Cup, where they were clearly knocked out at the early stages, and then that was an absolute media frenzy. So I think that's going to be key in terms of progressing forward, managing the media and making sure that your players are staying out of the limelight by whatever means necessary, really.
And I think England rugby seem to be. I mean, I understand it. Firstly, I get that point completely. Perhaps in my line of work as well, I'm a perpetrator of this as much as anyone else, and it is a fine line to toe. But I think England rugby are doing a pretty good job of kind of setting the team up well. I mean, I saw the other day that is it Manu Tagilagi's got like a podcast with them, and he was talking about like
yeah, the
coffee
O2
and
inside
rugby and
line.
stuff.
It's actually it's
And it's
pretty
like,
good, and it's an interesting way of dealing with it, where you just hit everything head on. So you don't really give the newspapers any chance to really get involved too much, because you're releasing everything yourself, and it's with obviously the growth of podcasts, as you know, it's a great way to get things out into the media universe, just by staying in front of everything. So there's nothing that's going to come back and bite you on the backside, basically.
yeah, exactly. They keep the press fed. They're not going to go hunting for anything, It's
Spot on.
I guess that's the
Yeah,
idea.
and there's some
And
good
that makes
listening.
sense.
I've had many a days on work while I've been listening to such podcasts. So it's definitely keeping me involved.
There you go. When you finish this, hop on over to O2 Inside Line. Going back to this kind of first weekend lineup, then we've pointed out New Zealand, South Africa on Saturday, France, Argentina also on Saturday. Any
This
expectations?
has the opportunity to be a really good game or an absolutely terrible one. It just depends which French side decides they want to travel, whether they're going to be competitive or not. I do see it going France's way, but again, Argentina, they've always been able to thrive on the big stage. But I think France will take that one.
Will the result or the performance for France kind of
Again, it's
mark
difficult to say.
their campaign?
The French are very temperamental, both in rugby and generally their being. So when it comes to the later stages, you never know which team's going to turn up. Like I said before, it's a strange, but they could be world beaters or they could just be absolutely dreadful. And a lot of that comes down to the manner in which they play, with the lack of structure, and almost trying to embed structure on players that don't thrive on structure has this catastrophic turn of events, basically, where you just capitulate and players don't want to play, and we've seen that in recent years.
And then the other match of Saturday, the second
Yes.
day, is Australia.
Very
Fiji.
interesting.
I mean, Australia had to be the favourites going into that one, but Fiji could cause an upset, I guess. Is the
Absolutely.
kind of
I mean,
expectation.
Fiji, they're renowned for their physical and their emotive style of rugby, where they're playing this rugby to treat the crowd almost, and it's something quite lost on international rugby, but is amazing to see. So I believe there'll be a lot of people supporting Fiji, and it'll be just about everyone that's not Australian. But again, I do see Australia coming out on top there. They've just been. I just think they'll be too strong, with too many good players across the park to fall there. But fingers crossed for an upset.
Looking to day 3 then, Italy, Namibia. Any expectations for this in terms of as a match to watch?
It's a tough one.
Or results?
Italy probably edging it for me. Namibia, they're kind of one of these hopeful outcasts, sort of on the outside of the top tier of international rugby. They've been poking away, same as Georgia. It's a similar situation, but I think Italy have been playing on the bigger stage a bit too long with their involvement in the Six Nations. I think they'll clinch that.
Ireland, Scotland. This is an interesting one. I guess Six Nations is probably the best predictor for this outcome.
It's possibly the game I'm looking forward to least in the opening round. Ireland, although like you say they're number one ranked in the world, have been pretty dire recently. They've squeezed out a win against Wales and just not been playing attractive rugby. And Scotland, they've just struggled. With the exception of one performance against Georgia and maybe like one second half against England, they've just not been up to par. So I think we're in for a fairly dire game with Ireland coming out on top.
England Tonga,
Mm.
the big one of Sunday, really.
England to win, but I believe they'll have the bigger bruises on the Monday morning. The
Just the
sheer
sheer
size
size
of
of the
every
pack.
single player. The Tongas have got a big point to prove after um, their massive loss to New Zealand. And I know it's a proud nation, so they're going to want to come back and they're going to want to absolutely smash someone. So yeah, I see England as favourites, but help take quite a beating in the process.
And the final one is kind of the first round of the pool stages. Wales
Yeah,
Georgia
it'll be
could be an
interesting,
interesting
very
match.
interesting. With obviously Wales again, another one of the number one ranked teams over the last few weeks. Um, so yeah, Georgia, they're an interesting one. Obviously, putting Graham Roundtree to sort of shore up their scrum because you know nothing is more scary than a big forward pack, but then a big forward pack that actually knows what they're doing at the scrum and line out is just going to be an absolutely dangerous prospect for anyone coming up against them. So I'm not sure what to expect from Georgia, apart from the obvious physicality and big scrum. Um, so it should be interesting. Again, still see Wales coming out on top there. Just the names they've got across the board. I think even with a few injuries, they're still too strong for Georgia.
So kind of what you'd expect then for this kind of the first round, if you like. All the favourites are pretty clear, aside from maybe the New Zealand South
Yeah, I
Africa
think
battle.
so. And Hart says South Africa in those, but yeah, I don't think we're in for many upsets.
Okay, I think that's a fairly good roundup of the first week and
Well,
what the
yeah,
Rugby World
it
Cup's all
should
about
be
this year.
fun. I'm looking forward to it.
You fancy coming back next week and we'll
Absolutely.
break
I'll see
down
you
what happened on
then.
that first round?
Pleasure.
Thanks, Mark.
I'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to episode